Thank you very much. It's really a treat for me to be here and to see so many of you who are interested in this waterway. And I had a chance to fly over in a helicopter the Detroit River today and the Rouge River and a large part of Lake St. Clair, and just to get a look at what, and I've flown over it many times because I've crisscrossed the country for the past couple of weeks many times, and I always look down and see Lake St. Clair on clear days. You can see it because the air traffic goes right over it. But this was the first time I'd gotten to see it at a level where I could actually see first of all, the use of it, how many people were out on the water using it, and also to see the degradation. Literally every 200, 300 feet up and down the banks of the Detroit River and the Rouge River, I could see people engaged in illegal activities. I could see plumes, all different colors, coming from tank farms, coming from junkyards, coming from CSOs that were peppering the banks. And these are people who are breaking the law, who are abusing a public trust, who are destroying something that belongs to the people. The Constitution of the state of Michigan says the people of the state own the lake. They own the waters of the lake. They own the fisheries of the lake. Everybody has a right to use them. Nobody has a right to use them in a way that will diminish or injure their use and enjoyment by others. This is the public trust. This is the bounties of the earth, and all of the people own it. Whether you're rich or poor, or humble or noble, every child in Detroit and every child in Michigan has a right, a God-given right, to go out and catch a walleye or a pike in Lake St. Clair and bring it home and feed it to his family proudly without having to live with the fear that he's poisoning them. And they can't do that. That right has been taken away from them, and it's been taken away from them by people who were willing to trade higher standards of living for themselves for lower quality of life for the rest of us. And that's really what this is about. It's people making money but making the rest of us poor because they're stealing something that is critical to the quality of life and to the economy of the people in this area and to the community. And that's ultimately what this battle is about. It's not about protecting fishes or walleye or pike or perch. It's about protecting community. It's about recognizing that the reason we're protecting this lake is because it enriches us in so many, many ways. It provides it's the parameters of our culture. It provides a landscape that we all share in common. It defines the people who live here as people the same way that the people in the Hudson Valley are defined by their environment and by the history of the Hudson Valley. And the people who started the Riverkeeper movement were people who didn't really consider themselves environmentalists. They were people who were fighting for their community. It was started in 1966 by a blue-collar coalition of commercial and recreational fishermen who, in a little village called Crotonville, New York, we have on the Hudson River one of the oldest commercial fisheries in North America. It's 350 years old. Many of the people I represent come from families that have been fishing the river since Dutch colonial times. It's a traditional gear, sustainable fishery. They use the same ash poles, the gill nets, the small open boats that the Algonquin Indians taught to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam and then passed down through the generations. One of the enclaves of the commercial fishery on the Hudson is a little village called Crotonville, New York, that's 30 or 40 miles north of New York City. And the people who lived in Crotonville in 1966 were not your prototypical tweed-jacketed, pipe-smoking, bearded, affluent environmentalists who were trying to protect distant wilderness areas in Montana or Wyoming or the Rockies, what have you. They were carpenters, lathers, electricians, factory workers. Half the people in that town made their living at some point or another crabbing or fishing the Hudson River. Most of them had little expectation that they would ever see Yosemite or Yellowstone or the Everglades. For them, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches and the swimming holes and the fishing holes of the Hudson River and the Croton River. Richie Garrett, who was the first president of the Riverkeeper organization, it was then called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, used to say about the Hudson, it's our Riviera, it's our Monte Carlo. Richie Garrett was a gravedigger from Austining, New York. He used to tell his new followers, I'll be the last to let you down. In 1966, Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton-Harmon rail yard, and the oil went up the Croton on the tides, and it blackened the beaches, and it made the shad taste of diesel, so that they couldn't be sold to the Fulton Fish Market. And all of the people in Crotonville came together in the only public building in the town, which was the Parker Bale American Legion Hall. There were 300 people in the room that night, leaning against the rifle racks hanging from the rafters. And this was a very patriotic community. Every home in Crotonville had an American flag on the roof. Almost all of the original founders, the board members and officers of the Riverkeeper were former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II and Korea. These weren't radicals. They weren't militants. They were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of this country. But that night they started talking about violence because they saw something that they thought they owned, which was the fisheries of the Hudson River and the purity of its waters, and it was being taken away from them, stolen by large corporate entities over whom they had no control. And they'd been to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution, to the Corps of Engineers and the Conservation Department and the Coast Guard, and they'd been given the bum's rush. At one point, the Corps Colonel told Richie Garrett, another former Marine named Art Glauca, they'd been there 20 separate occasions, begging him to do what the law required him to do, which was to shut down the Penn Central Pipe. And finally, he told them in exasperation, these are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, we can't treat them that way. And by this evening, in March of 1966, virtually everybody in Crotonville had come to the conclusion that government was in cahoots with the polluters, and that the only way that they were going to reclaim the Hudson for themselves is if they confronted the polluters directly. And somebody suggested that they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central Pipe and blow up the pipe. And somebody else said they should roll a mattress up and jam it up the pipe and flood the rail yard with its own waste. And somebody else suggested that they float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant and blow it up. Indian Point at that time was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. And then a guy stood up who was another former Marine, and his name was Bob Boyle, and he was the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated magazine, and he still is today. He's been there for 45 years, and he was a great fly fisherman and angler and spin fisherman. He'd written 6 books on fishing. He was one of the gurus of dry fly tying in this country. And 2 years before, he had written an article about angling in the Hudson for Sports Illustrated, and in researching that article, he had come across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. And that statute said that it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States, that you had to pay a high penalty if you got caught polluting, but also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And he had sent a copy of the law over to the libel lawyers at Time Inc., and he said, is this still good law? And they sent him back a memo saying, in 80 years it has never been enforced, but it's still on the books, and it's still good law, this bounty provision. And that night, he came to that meeting with a copy of the law and a copy of the memo from the lawyers. And when these men were talking about violence, he stood up and he passed out a copy of the law and he said, you know, we shouldn't be talking about breaking the law. We should be talking about enforcing it. And they resolved that evening that they were going to start a group that was then called the Fishermen's Association, later became Riverkeeper, and that they were going to go out and track down and prosecute every polluter on the Hudson. 18 months later, they collected the first bounty in United States history under this 80-year-old statute. They got $2,000. They shut down the Penn Central Pipe forever. This was incidentally a huge amount of money in Crotonville, New York in 1968. There were 2 weeks of wild celebration in the town, and they used the money that was left over to go after Ciba Geigy and Tuck Tape and American Cyanamid and Standard Brands and the government agencies that then and today are the biggest polluters on the Hudson. The New York National Guard for filling a wetland in Peekskill, Westchester County for dumping toxics at Croton Point. In 1973, they collected the highest penalty in United States history against a corporate polluter. They got $200,000 from Anaconda Wire and Cable in Hastings, New York. They used that money to construct a boat, which they called the Riverkeeper, which today patrols the river, tracking down polluters. In 1983, they again used bounty money to hire their first full-time Riverkeeper, a former commercial fisherman named John Cronin. He hired me a year later as the prosecuting attorney for the group. And about a year after that, we started at Pace Law School in White Plains, New York, which is a law school that specializes in environmental law, environmental litigation clinic, where I and my partner Carl Copeland have 10 students, third-year law students, who by a special court order are permitted to practice law under our supervision as if they were attorneys. They can do anything a lawyer can do. We give them each about 4 polluters to sue at the beginning of the semester. They file complaints, they do discovery, they do depositions, they go to court, they argue their cases. Of course, if they don't win the case, they don't pass the course. And since we started the clinic, we've brought over 200 successful legal actions against Hudson River polluters. We force polluters on the river to spend over $2 billion on remediation of the river. And today, the Hudson River, which was a national joke in 1966, is today an international model for ecosystem protection. It's the richest water body in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean, and the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson River has inspired now the creation of keepers on waterways across North America. We have a national waterkeeper alliance which licenses the new groups to get started. We've trademarked the name, and I was in Anacostia in Washington, D.C. Yesterday, launching an Anacostia River Keeper, which makes a link. We also now have a Potomac River Keeper. This is incidentally our 50th River Keeper out here that we're launching today. Well, we now have keepers on every major river system on the East Coast, from the Bay of Fundy in Canada, the Petitcodiac River in Canada, all the way down to the St. Johns in Florida. On the West Coast, all the major river systems from Cook Inlet in Alaska, the Puget Sound, the Columbia, the Tualatin, the Willamette, the San Francisco Bay, Santa Monica Bay, San Diego Bay, the Orange County coast, Santa Barbara Channel, all have keepers on them now. We have a whole picket line on the east and west coast protecting, fighting on behalf of local communities, patrolling the area, and then litigating against the polluters to restore those waterways to the local communities and to their use. We have 130 applications now for new keepers. We're the fastest growing national environmental group, and we will have, probably within 5 years, we'll have keepers on every significant waterway across North America. I love my job. I love going to court and fighting against the bad guys and teaching my students and working on the river and working with the fishermen, the commercial fishermen, the recreational fishermen. About 6 years ago, my clients asked me to do something that I never wanted to do, which was to spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C. lobbying against Congress and against these anti-environmental provisions, the 104th and then the 105th and 106th Congress. And I have to say this, I represent fishermen. They come up from the range of the political spectrum, from right-wing Republican to left-wing Democrat, but they saw what was happening on Capitol Hill over the last 6 years as the gravest threat, not only to their livelihoods, but to their values, to their sense of citizenship, to their sense of community, and they were right. If the laws that have passed Capitol Hill over the last 6 years had actually been signed into law by the president, we would effectively have no significant federal environmental law left in this country. And that's not exaggeration. That's not hyperbole. That is a fact. Many of our laws would have remained on the books in one way or the form or the other, but they would have been unenforceable. And it would be like Mexico, which has these wonderful environmental laws, but nobody knows about them and nobody conforms with them because they can't be enforced. Now, if you ask the people on Capitol Hill who are promoting this kind of legislation, why are you doing this? And this is what I've spent a lot of the last 6 years doing. What they invariably say is, well, the time has come in our nation's history where we have to choose now between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations and dignified, sustainable communities. And if, on the other hand, we want to do what they've been urging us to do on Capitol Hill, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, to convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, to have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy. But our children are going to pay for our joyride, and they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes and poor health and huge cleanup costs that amplify over time and that they're never going to be able to afford. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of passing the cost of our generation's prosperity and loading it onto the backs of our children. And if you don't believe that, if you have doubts about that, look at the nations that didn't invest in their environment back in the 70s the way that we did in this country. All of our environmental investment began on Earth Day 1970. And I remember what it was like before Earth Day. I remember the Cuyahoga River burning for a week with flames that were 8 stories high and nobody being able to put it out. And I remember when they declared Lake Erie dead, that there was no oxygen-borne life in it at all, and that I couldn't swim in the Hudson or the Potomac or the Charles growing up, and what the air smelled like. In my home in Northern Virginia, we had to dust every day because of the smog. And Washington, D.C., which wasn't even an industrial city, it stank. Some days you couldn't see down the block, and we had black smoke billowing out of every stack, and thousands of Americans dying every year in our cities from smog events. In 1962, 1,500 New Yorkers died in a week. And these young congressmen on Capitol Hill who are trying to dismantle our environmental laws, they don't remember this. And they don't understand the benefits we've gotten through these investments in our environmental infrastructure. And I remember many of our animals were disappearing. I'm a falconer, and I train hawks, and I've done this since I was a little boy. I'm a licensed master falconer, and I've written a book on falconry, and I just stepped down as president of the New York State Falconers Association, but I was interested in predatory birds and raptors since I was a little boy. And I started training them when I was 11, but from when I was 3 or 4 years old, I was always looking at them and fascinated by them. When I was 9 or 10 years old, I could go down to Washington. We lived in Northern Virginia, maybe once or twice a week with 9 or 10 of my brothers and sisters to eat lunch with my father at the Justice Department, or occasionally to visit my uncle at the White House. Whenever I went down to Washington, D.C., I'd always look down Pennsylvania Avenue to the old post office building in Washington, and on the roof of that, there was a pair of Eastern and Adams peregrine falcons nesting that had been there for generations. All the falconers knew about them and the bird watchers. And this was our most spectacular predatory bird in North America. It was salmon pink. It had a beautiful white coverlet over its nair. It could fly over 200 miles an hour. It was the most beautiful subspecies of peregrine. And I could watch these birds come off the roof of the post office, fly down Pennsylvania Avenue at those speeds, and pick pigeons out of the air 40 feet above the heads of the pedestrians, and then fly them back to the cupola of the post office. And to me, seeing a sight like that was far more exciting than visiting my uncle at the White House. But that's a sight that my children will never see, because that bird went extinct in 1963 from DDT poisoning. And we do have peregrines now back on the East Coast again, but it's not the same bird. It's a hybridized progeny of 17 different subspecies that were kind of mixed and matched and bred in captivity and then released into the wild. And it's nowhere near as spectacular as this creature that took 1 million years to evolve and then disappeared in the blink of an eye because of ignorance and greed. And many of our others, I flew over this lake today and saw herons, great blue herons and little brown herons. When I was a boy, I never saw those. We see them every day now in New York, but they were gone. And we didn't see cormorants or egrets. And our songbirds were disappearing for the same reason, DDT. In 1970, this accumulation of insults drove 20 million Americans out on the street, 10% of our population, the largest public demonstration in United States history, demanding that our political leaders return to the American people the ancient environmental rights that had been taken from our citizens during the previous 80 years. And the political system responded. Republicans and Democrats got together and passed this extraordinary deluge of environmental legislation, 28 major environmental laws over the next 10 years that protect our air and our water and our endangered species and wetlands and food safety, etc. And those laws, in turn, have become the models for over 150 nations around the world that had their own versions of Earth Day and started making their own investments in the environment. But there's a lot of nations that didn't do that. And they're almost always the nations that didn't have strong democracies, because democracy and the environment are intertwined. Without a strong democracy, you will not get environmental protection, because the only thing that nature can't vote and our children can't vote and future generations can't vote. So the only system that can protect them is a democracy that gives individuals and small communities a voice and an ability to protect resources that belong to the children. And in country, you look around, there's a direct correlation between tyranny in the various governments around the world and environmental degradation. whether it's the right-wing tyrannies of Brazil in the 60s and 70s, or burning the Amazon, or Saddam Hussein, or the left-wing tyrannies in Eastern Europe, China, and the Soviet Union. That's where the really ugly stuff is. Russia's a good example. They had no democracy, so they had no environmental law. And they didn't have, for example, NEPA, which was our first and most important environmental law. That's the National Environmental Policy Act. That's the law that requires government agencies to do environmental impact reviews before they destroy or dispose of significant environmental resources. They didn't have that in Russia, and because of that, the Aral Sea, which is the largest freshwater body on Earth after the Great Lakes, is now a desert. They didn't have a Clean Water Act. And because of that, the Sea of Azov in Russia, which was the richest fishery on Earth after the Chesapeake Bay, is now a biological wasteland. They didn't have nuclear regulatory review requirements of the kind we passed after Earth Day in this country, and because of that, 1/5 of Belarusia is now permanently uninhabitable because of radiation contamination. In Turkey, where I was this autumn, they don't have a Clean Water Act. 300 species have disappeared from the Marmara Sea over the last 15 years. The Black Sea will be dead within 10. In Thailand, where I also was in the autumn, they don't have a Clean Air Act. You can see people on any street in Bangkok wearing gas masks and particle masks. The New York Times recently reported that the average child in Bangkok, and this is a city larger than New York, 10.5 million people, the average child who reaches the age of 6 has permanently lost 7 IQ points because of the density of airborne lead contamination at ground level, because they didn't have a Clean Air Act that said you got to get the lead out of the gasoline. In China, where they don't have a Clean Air Act, they lose 100,000 people dead every year from smog events. One of the growth industries today in Beijing is oxygen bars, where people literally go to buy a breath of fresh air. In Mexico City, if you own an automobile, you can legally only drive it 3.5 days a week. Smog inversions kill 10,000 people a year and shut down their principal state industries, sometimes for weeks at a time. In those nations, and many, many, many others, environmental injury has matured into economic catastrophe. And that's what would have happened here if we hadn't made that investment back in the 70s, and that's what will happen if we allow this foolhardy Congress to dismantle the environmental laws that we passed back then, or allow the governors of the various states to simply stop enforcing them, which is another trend we're seeing all over this country today. And one of the things that I've done over the last 6 years is to constantly go around and confront this argument that an investment in our environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It doesn't diminish our wealth. It's an investment in infrastructure. The same as investing in telecommunications or road construction. It's an investment that we have to make if we want to ensure the economic vitality of our generation and the next. The other thing that they love to say on Capitol Hill is, well, the reason we're going to get rid of these federal environmental laws and we're going to return control to the states, and we're going to have states' rights and community control. And after all, that's the essence of democracy. And local control, and we're going to have, and the states, after all, are in the best position to police and patrol and protect their own environment. But the real outcome of that devolution will not be community control. It will be corporate control. And we remember in the Hudson Valley, the 1960s version of community control, when this story was repeated 10,000 times across this country in communities on virtually every river system that we have. But in the Hudson, it was GE, General Electric Company, that was the culprit. They came into the town of Fort Edwards in Hudson Falls, New York, and they said to the town fathers, we're going to build you a spanking new factory, and we're going to bring in 1,500 new jobs, and we're going to raise your tax base. And all you have to do is waive your environmental laws and let us dump our toxic PCBs into the Hudson River and persuade the state of New York to write us a permit to do it. And if you don't do that, we're going to move to New Jersey, across the river. And we're going to do it from over there. And Glens Falls, Hudson Falls took the bait, and 2 decades later, General Electric closed those factories and fired the workers. And they left behind a $2 billion cleanup bill that nobody in the Hudson Valley can afford to pay. And I have 1,000 commercial fishermen, my clients, who are now permanently out of work because although the Hudson is loaded with fish, the fish are still loaded with General Electric's PCBs, and they're too toxic, most species, to legally sell in the marketplace. And the barge traffic on the upper river has dried up because the shipping channels are too toxic to dredge. And all of that land that was occupied by General Electric's plants with tax breaks from the grateful locality is now permanently off the tax rolls because nobody else is going to risk the liability of settling in on that and rob from that community for recreational purposes or for revenue. It's simply dead land. And every woman between Oswego, New York, and Albany has elevated levels of PCB in her breast milk, and everybody in the Hudson Valley has General Electric's PCBs in our flesh and in our organs. And what the federal laws were meant to do was to put an end to that kind of corporate blackmail and to stop these corporations from coming into communities and whipsawing one community in New York against another in New Jersey, or one in Michigan against another in Ohio, to get them to race to bottom, to lower their environmental standards, to recruit these filthy industries in exchange for the promise of a few years of pollution-based prosperity, and to ransom their children's futures in the process. And what the federal laws did is they democratized our country in an extraordinary way. You look at all the progressive social movements in U.S. history, the labor movement, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, they're all about democratizing America, about spreading out power to more and more people, allowing more and more the most vulnerable people, the most alienated people, to participate in the dialogues that determine the destinies of our communities. And I would argue that none of them has done that as effectively as the environmental movement. If anybody here, if some big shot, a government agency or a big company tries to build an incinerator or a landfill in your backyard, and you think this is going to be a disaster for your community, and you can prove it, and you're willing to devote your life's energy to trying to stop them, you can probably do it. You can demand, you have a right to a full environmental impact statement that forces the proponent of that project to disclose all the costs and benefits to your community over time. And you have a right to a hearing on that in which you can cross-examine witnesses and direct examine witnesses, call your own, and a transcript of that hearing, and a judicial decision of that transcript based upon a rational interpretation of the transcript. And if there's a polluter in your backyard and government fails to enforce the law against them, anybody in this room can step into the shoes of the United States Attorney and prosecute that polluter for $25,000 a day fines and for injunctive relief. And we have these FOIL laws and toxic inventory laws that force the government and industry to become transparent and to disclose what they're discharging in your community. This is democracy. If you live in Canada, which is a democracy, and somebody tries to build an incinerator in your backyard, you have two remedies. One is you can write a letter to the editor, and the other is you can vote against that government when it comes up for election in 3 years. We have community-based democracy in this country that is extraordinary. It gives us extraordinary powers, and we don't exercise them. And that's what the channel keeper's job is going to be, to start exercising the democratic rights we have. Now, industry sees this, and they say, this is a disaster. It's going to take me 2 years to build that plant. It should only take 2 months. And in fact, democracy in the short term is inefficient, it's costly, it's awkward, it's difficult. But in the long term, it's the most efficient system that we have. And if we'd had these laws in place when industry got us and government tried to get us to walk down the nuclear highway back in the 60s before Earth Day, we have saved $1 trillion. What Forbes magazine said the biggest economic disaster in the history of mankind was the American experience with nuclear power. And we would have spent that, instead of driving our children into debt with $1 trillion of cost overruns at these plants, we could have spent that on something that was useful to our communities by forcing them at the outset to answer the question, what are you going to do with the waste when you decommission this plant? And they said at that time, we'll figure it out when the time comes. They still haven't figured it out. And if we'd had an EIS, they would have never gotten us down that highway. And we would have invested instead in solar or renewables or something that would have given long-term benefit to our communities. The last thing that I would say about kind of the arguments that I hear on Capitol Hill is that people say, this is about the free market economy. We want to get rid of these environmental regulations and have a free market. Let me tell you this. The best thing that could happen to the environment is if we had a true free market economy. If you look around you, the most egregious environmental injury in this country and every other country comes not from the free market, but from the suspension of free market rules, from a fat cat who's using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market. You show me pollution, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you somebody who's not paying their way. You look at all the Western resource issues that have driven the environmental movement in this country over the past 4 decades, water and grazing and mining and lumber, they're all about subsidies. If you're a farmer in the state of Idaho, you can get unlimited amounts of federal water. It's our water. You and I own those rivers and streams. We bought them with Louisiana Purchase money. We built the dams, the irrigation systems, and the canals, the federal taxpayer. They can get unlimited amounts of our water for 11 cents an acre foot. If we left that water in the river, put it over the dams for hydropower, or sold to the city of Los Angeles for drinking water, we would get $800 an acre foot. That's the true free market value. So we're giving each of these farmers a $799 subsidy on every acre foot they use. Because they get the resource for free, they use it wastefully. They grow rice in the desert. They put the Louisiana rice farmers out of business, and they've sucked every river in Idaho dry. There hasn't been a salmon season in Idaho in 15 years. If you're a rancher in the state of Idaho, and you want to graze your cow on my property, you're going to pay me $18 a month. What if you have the political clout to get onto our federal property that you and I own? How much do you think they pay us? $1.61 a month. So we're giving each of these ranchers a $16.39 subsidy on every animal they have every month. Because they get the resource for free, they use it wastefully. They overgraze the land. They've turned 1 million acres of our land into desert. They put the Oklahoma cattlemen out of business because they don't have federal lands in Oklahoma. And these aren't, by the way, the poor rural cowboy, the icon of American culture that all of us want to preserve. 75% of the grazing leases in Idaho are owned by a tiny handful of families, mainly J.R. Simplot and David Russell of Santa Barbara, who alone controls 1 million acres. These are the richest people in America. These are the same people who financed this revolution on Capitol Hill in 1994, and they still have their indentured servants in the United States Capitol demanding that we have capitalism for the poor, and at the same time, they're fighting as hard as they can to continue this system of socialism for the rich in the western states, where we pour $30 billion a year in federal subsidies to these. And I have to tell you, they're a bunch of crybabies, because I have to deal with them all the time, and you can hear them whining when you pull the federal nipple out of their mouths. If you want to cut... If you want to cut old growth timber in this country, you got to come to us. You and I, we own it all, the federal taxpayer. There's none left on the private land. It was all cut in the 80s. In the Tongass National Forest, there are trees that were growing when Christ was walking the earth. Some of these 500-year-old Sitka spruce and cedars, 30 foot around at the base, a single tree has a value of $40,000. What do we sell them for? $1.89 a piece. And half the Tongass was cut by Alaska Pulp and Paper, which is 100% Japanese owned. And I saw them over, they didn't even mill them here. They sent them with the bark still on them over to Osaka Bay, where I saw them stacked last summer on the beach and under the water, waiting for the next century. And to add insult to injury, you and I spend $250 million every year building logging roads so that these cut-and-run timber companies can get up to the last inaccessible parts of our national forest and cut the last of our children's trees. The worst ripoff is mining. And you know, if you're a mining company, and they're all foreign-owned, and you find gold or silver on my private land in any of the western states, you're going to pay me a 16% royalty to mine it. How much do you think they pay us, you and me, when they find it on the federal land? Zero. They get it all for free. They get the gold, we get the shaft. A couple of years ago, American Barrick, which is a Canadian company, found one of the biggest mother lodes in history, $16 billion worth of gold on our federal land in Nevada. They got the whole claim for $5,000. Why did they pay $5,000? Because I said it was for free. Well, the law says not only do they get all the gold below the land for free, but they get to keep all the land above the gold for $2.50 an acre, which was the price that was established by Ulysses Grant in 1879 when he was trying to dragoon Easterners to go out and risk their necks and settle the Indian territories. So he wanted to keep the land cheap. And these mining companies have been able to have such exquisite political clout. They've been able to keep the same price on that land for 130 years. And do you think that if any of you got tired of the Michigan winters and decided that you wanted to go down and live in sunny Nevada, and you went down to the BLM office in Culver City and said, give me some of that federal land for $2.50 an acre, that anybody would give it to you? No, they would not. The law says that only the mining companies get that deal, but when they're done with it, they'll sell it to you, but they'll sell it to you for upwards of $10,000 an acre, because that's the true free market value of that land, and you won't want it at that point anyway, because they've also used their clout to write themselves waivers to almost all of the federal environmental laws, so when they leave, they leave behind a huge waste, a pile of toxic waste, tailings that leach arsenic and mercury and cyanide into our western streams every time it rains. According to the Federal Bureau of Mines, there are now 9,000 miles of our western trout streams that have been destroyed because of toxic discharges from private companies on our public lands. And who gets the cleanup bill? You and me. In Montana alone, there are 11,000 toxic waste sites on our federal land by private companies, and you and I will spend $20 billion over the next 10 years cleaning them up. That's not the free market. The free market says if you want to bring a product to market, you pay for it to get there. You don't get somebody else, and that includes the cost of cleaning up after yourself, which was a lesson we were all supposed to have learned in kindergarten. But what all pollution is it's somebody who's devised a way to make you pay part of their costs of doing business. The pollution that I saw today on the Rouge River and the Detroit River and that we have in New York State from General Electric, it's a subsidy. When General Electric dumped its PCBs into the Hudson River, it was avoiding one of the costs of bringing its product to market, which was the cost of properly disposing of a dangerous process chemical. And avoiding the cost, it was able to outcompete its competitors and enrich its board, etc., make itself a stronger company. But the cost didn't disappear. It went into the fish, and it made the people sick, and it put the men out of work, and it dried up the barge traffic, and it took the land off the tax rolls. And all of those impacts impose costs on the rest of us that should, in a true free market system, have been reflected in the price of General Electric's product when it finally made it to the marketplace. But like all polluters, General Electric was able to use chemical ingenuity and political clout to escape the discipline of the free market. And that's what all pollution is. And who bears the cost? Well, the costs are borne by all of us, but they're borne by the poorest members of our community hardest. The people, the commercial fishermen on the Hudson who didn't have the lobbyists in Albany, who lost not only their health but their jobs. If you look at what happens to toxics in this country, they always end up in the poor neighborhoods. We know there's nothing safe you can do with them. If you put them in a landfill, they are going into groundwater until they repeal the law of gravity. If you put them in an incinerator, they are going into the air and they're going to make the people in that neighborhood sick. So if you live in a neighborhood like Lawrence does, Katona, New York, or Bedford, New York, or Greenwich, the places that I live, we know the lawyers. We're not going to let them put a landfill in our backyard. We're not, and if we call the mayor up, we're going to say, don't let them do it. So the toxics float around until they land in a neighborhood where the people can least afford to get sick. And it's almost always the poorest neighborhoods in our country. 4 out of every 5 toxic waste dumps in America is in a black neighborhood. The largest toxic waste dump in America is Emile, Alabama, which is 85% black. The highest concentration of toxic waste dumps in America is the south side of Chicago. The most contaminated zip code in California is East LA. But it's not just the poor who get hurt, it's all of us, because we own these resources. That's what the law says. That's ancient law. It's called natural law by legal scholars, God-given law, rights that no human institution can take away. It was in the Code of Justinian, which was the Roman law, that said those things that are not susceptible to private ownership are owned by all of the people. Everybody has a right. This is the air, the water, the dune lands, the wetlands, and the fisheries, and the wandering animals. These are public trust assets. If you were rich or poor in ancient Rome, as long as you were a citizen, if you were humble or noble, the emperor himself could not block you from fishing. He couldn't sell monopolies on the fisheries. He couldn't take something away from you because those things belong to the public. And that law, it became part of the Magna Carta, and it's part of the Constitution of every state. Now, the people who assembled these fishermen in Crotonville, New York in 1966, they weren't sophisticated people. They were smart, but they weren't sophisticated. They probably didn't know that much about the Code of Justinian or the Magna Carta, but they did know that the Constitution of New York State said that they own the fishes in the river, and they knew that their families had exploited them for 300 years. And they saw General Electric coming along in Penn Central and stealing the fish from them, liquidating them for cash. They said, the Constitution says we own these fish, but we can't use them anymore. Somebody stole them from us. And they said there was no due process. They just disappeared. Their industry, because it had political clout, replaced our 300-year-old industry. And they said, that is an act of theft. They stole something that the Constitution says belongs to us. And we should treat these people as thieves. And they began hauling them off to court and winning their cases. And they not only succeeded in restoring the Hudson, but they also generated this extraordinary wealth of environmental law that's now used by communities all across North America to protect their own backyards. And the Hudson today is not only the richest water body, but it's the last water body left in the North Atlantic that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish. It's a Noah's Ark, it's a species warehouse. What happens when we destroy a resource like this out here, like Lake St. Clair or the St. Clair Channel or the Detroit River, the Rouge River, and turn it over to polluters? What happens when we exterminate a species? To me, that's one of the worst sins that one generation can commit against another. I come from a religious tradition that teaches me that man was given dominion over nature, but that we were also given an obligation of stewardship. And what does it say about us as a generation when half the species on the face of the planet go extinct during our lifetime? And that's what we will experience, and our children will experience, if we allow the present trends to continue. What happens when we destroy nature? And this goes back to what I started off with. We are not protecting these things for the sake of the fishes and the birds or the walleye or the pike or the sturgeon. We're protecting it because we recognize that nature enriches us. It enriches us economically. Yes, it's the base of our economy. The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, and we ignore that at our peril. But it also enriches us recreationally and aesthetically and culturally and historically. It unites us as a people. You know, particularly for the Americans, you look around this room, we come from all over the planet. A Frenchman doesn't have to wonder about his Frenchiness because he speaks French. He looks kind of like other Frenchmen. But Americans, we all look different. We don't share a common culture or religion or language or race or color. And what allows us to call ourselves a community, a people? There's two things. One is shared values, which is a commitment to constitutional democracy, and the other is the land. And when we destroy the land, when we treat it with contempt, what we're saying is this isn't really about community. It's about self-interest. It's about it's just real estate. It's just a commodity upon which a bunch of strangers have gathered to increase the size of their own pile and then move on. And whoever dies with the most stuff wins. And you know, in this country, if you look at our literature and from the beginning of time, our literary leaders and cultural leaders and political and spiritual leaders were telling the American people, you don't have to be embarrassed. And this is what, Lawrence got this wonderful quote from Teddy Roosevelt. It was the same thing. They said, you don't have to be embarrassed because you don't have the 1,500 years of culture that the Europeans had. Because you have this relationship with the wilderness and with nature, the unspoiled work of the Creator. And that's going to be the source of your values and your virtues and your character as a people. And that's going to be the parameters of your community. And throughout time, if you look at the American literature, the unifying thread in every valid piece of classic American literature is this conviction that nature is the critical defining element of American culture. It's part of our history, it's our poetry, it's in our art. It defines us as a people. And so how do we go about destroying something like this when it's so much a part of who we are? We are literally destroying the basis of community. And when we do that, we're going to be in trouble. But we're protecting these things because they enrich us in all these ways, and spiritually as well. And human beings have other appetites besides money. And if we don't feed them, we're not going to grow up. We're not going to fulfill ourselves. We're not going to become the kind of beings we're supposed to become. When we destroy nature, we diminish ourselves. We impoverish our children. We're not fighting, the environmental movement is not fighting to preserve those ancient forests in the Pacific Northwest, as Rush Limbaugh loves to say, for the sake of a spotted owl. We're preserving those forests because we believe that the trees have more value to humanity standing than they would have if we cut them down. And I'm not fighting to save the Hudson River, and Brad and Doug are not fighting to save the St. Clair Channel for the sake of the shad or the sturgeon or the stripers or the walleye or the pickerel or the pike or the herring or the perch, but because we believe that our lives will be richer and our children's lives will be richer if we live in a world where there are those fishes in the St. Clair River and in the Hudson River. And we can see the recreational fishermen and the commercial fishermen on the Hudson out in their small boats doing what they've been doing for generations since the Algonquin Indians taught them how to do it. And my children can see those and touch them when they come to shore, to repair their nets, to wait out the tides, and in doing that, connect themselves to 350 years of New York State history. and understand that they're part of something larger than themselves. They're part of a continuum. They're part of a community. I don't want my children to grow up in a world where there are no commercial fishermen and where there are no family farmers, where it's all this industrial meat production, and where people can't swim in this lake or eat the fish from it, and where we've lost touch with the seasons and the tides and the things that connect us to 10,000 generations of human beings that were here before there were laptops, and that connect us ultimately to God. And I don't believe that nature is God, and I don't think we ought to be worshiping it as God. But I do believe that it's the way that God communicates to us most forcefully. And God talks to human beings through many vectors, through each other, through organized religion, through the great books of those religions, through wise people, and through art and literature and music and poetry, but nowhere with such force and detail and clarity and texture and grace and joy as through creation. And for me, therefore, destroying these things, something like allowing somebody to destroy this lake or to contaminate it so your kids can't swim in it or can't eat the fish from it, is the moral equivalent of tearing the last pages out of the last Bible or Torah or Talmud or Quran or Upanishad on earth. It's a cause that I think it's imprudent for us to impose upon ourselves, and I doubt if we have the right to impose it upon our children. And that's really all that this battle is about, and all the Keeper movement. It's about recognizing that we have an obligation to the next generation and to the members of our community who don't always participate in the political process by which these resources are allocated, because they're too poor, because they don't have the political clout, or they come from dysfunctional neighborhoods. And our obligation to those other members of our community is expressed by the term sustainability. And that we live in a community, and that being part of a community is painful, because we can't just make decisions based upon our own self-interest. We have to account for the impacts of those decisions on others. And that ethic, that obligation is expressed by that term sustainability. And what that word means is, all it means is that God wants us to use the things that we've been given, the bounties of the earth, to enrich ourselves, to improve our quality of life, to serve others. But we can't use them up. We can't sell the farm piece by piece in order to pay for the groceries. We can't drain the pond to catch the fish. We can live off the interest. We can't go into the capital. That belongs to our children. And what we do as environmental advocates in the Riverkeeper movement, what Brad is going to do, and what Doug is going to do, and what the attorneys are going to do. And I'd like if the attorneys just stand up, the people who are going to represent them. Even if they haven't asked you yet, please stand up. And what they're going to do is they're going to elbow their way into the courtrooms and into the back hallways of the state capitals and of Washington, D.C., where the big shots are, where the big automobile and the big municipalities and big agriculture and big oil and big mining and big gas. And they're back there with their indentured servants in the political process. They're cutting up the pie that belongs to you and me and our children, the fresh air, the clean water, the abundant fisheries. And they're dividing it among themselves, liquidating it for cash, and stuffing their pockets. And for the short term, the present shouts, the future whispers. And what we do is we go into those convocations, elbow our way up to those tables, and we say to them, we are emissaries for the future, and we demand an accounting. We want to know what you're doing with the things that don't belong to you, with the things that belong to our children. And I'll close with a proverb from the Lakota people that's been expropriated to some extent by the environmental movement, where they said, we didn't inherit this planet from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. And I would add to that if we don't return to them something that is roughly the equivalent of what we receive, that they'll have the right to ask us some very, very difficult questions. This is a really exciting time for me to be out here, because I'm seeing keepers all over the country grow up, but there's no place that I'm more excited about this. I have to say, I flew over this today, and I felt like Lewis and Clark seeing, an unexploited wilderness for the first time as a trial lawyer, an environmental trial lawyer. This is a target-rich environment. There are... And I really, really hope that we can get out there and start a fist fight right away with every one of them, because we're going to win ultimately, and they're not going to come to the table till we slug them a couple of times, but once you get a couple of victories, you see they all march in. And that's what's going to happen here, and we're going to clean up this waterway, and we're going to change the ethics about it, because right now people are saying, well, the next guy's doing it, and the next guy's doing it, and the next guy's doing it, and what we got to do is say, yeah, but he's paying $10 million in fines, so you better stop. And that's what we need to do. We need to pick a fight with every single one of these people and do it fast and get them to start cleaning up this. What they're doing has been illegal for 30 years. They can no longer claim, oh, we didn't know this was bad. It's been illegal for 30 years, and I watched them doing it. Any district attorney's office in the country, if a kid throws a rock through a window, they'll prosecute that kid. But if somebody puts poison in a water supply where the fish are being poisoned and eaten by 4.5 million people, and where there's 38% of the fish that are taken out of the Great Lakes are taken out of this lake, and people are poisoning it, that is child abuse. And those people ought to be prosecuted as if they were, this is an attack on society. This is theft, it's child abuse, it's assault, and it's battery. And these people ought to be prosecuted for it. What they're doing is wrong. It's immoral and it's illegal. And it's been that way for at least 30 years. And it's time now that we have a new marshal has come to Dodge City, and I want to introduce you to the two new marshals, to Brad Sands and to Doug Martz. If you guys could come up here. These are our two St. Clair Channel keepers. Officially, as today, they get the license. Thank you all very much for your help, for your commitment, and please open your pocketbooks for these guys, because they're going to be on the front line fighting for every one of you and for your children. Thank you all very much.
Good evening. I don't think there's anything left to be said. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody that helped us put this together. The board of directors, all the people that have contributed. I know there's been a lot of talk about how we're going to make these changes. Litigation, all the tools that we have. But I want to assure you one thing, that we're going to empower the communities with the information they need to make the correct decisions and help us. Thank you.
John Snyder, where are you out here? He and I started as the sludge busters, driving that crazy Cadillac with a toilet on the roof all over the state of Michigan. I then was put on the Blue Ribbon Committee to help write the report that John Hertel put together for this county, and I'm going to bring him up here in a minute. Then, and now, I am chairman of the Water Quality Board for Macomb County as a citizen. I don't get paid one nickel to do this, and I'm grateful to have the chance to do it. I'm now the river keeper for the American side with Brad, and we're going to go out and do what Bobby said. We're going to clean this mess up for our children, just like our sign says up here. I want to thank my wife. My wife has endured all this for 6 years. I want to thank her so much for enduring this. It's been hectic. In the last 6 weeks, In the last 6 weeks, John Schneider and I prayed morning and night. And I mean, literally prayed to our God, Jesus, that we'd get through this event. It was nerve-wracking. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Remember, I come from the dark side, as some people might say. I was a builder. The dark side, yes. But we prayed night and day, every day, so that this would turn out good, that Bobby Kennedy would show up here tonight. When this morning, when I had Channel 4's helicopter lined up, and I got a call from Bobby that the flight had been changed, I almost passed out. But everything worked well. I'd like to bring 3 of our board members up here. It shows that we have unity in both parties. I'd like to bring Chairman John Hertel of the Macomb County Commission up here, please. Say a few words. I'd like Carl Marlinga, the prosecutor for Macomb County, to come up here, please. And I'd like Bill Neron, St. Clair Shores City Councilman, if he's here, to please come up and say a few words. These 3 gentlemen are on our board as citizens, not as chairman of the county, not as prosecutor, or not as St. Clair Shores City Councilman. I'd like to John Hertel, chairman, to say a few words first, please.
I want to make sure Bobby's listening to this. In 1996, I was in Ithaca, New York, and I was sitting in an audience at a convocation for graduation at Cornell University. My daughter was graduating, and she was getting her degree in plants and soil. And I was really, really looking forward to the convocation because the speaker was Robert Kennedy Jr. And I must tell you that it was in no way a disappointment. It was better than I expected it to be. But one thing happened that I didn't expect. Because I'd been on the Board of Commissioners for several years, and I'd become very frustrated about the fact that every year we were having more beach closings, and every year the situation kept getting worse about Lake St. Clair. And I have to tell you, in listening to his story about what they had to fight in the Hudson River Valley, and what they had to do to clean that up, and the success that they had, it inspired me. And you talk about people getting inspired. They get inspired for a short time and then it goes away. Not with me. He inspired me so much that when I came back here, I met with Carl Marlinga, Doug Martz, all kinds of other people from the community. We put together the Blue Ribbon Commission on Lake St. Clair. We put together the first water quality board made up of citizens in the country. And we put together the swim team and the special prosecutor. And I want to thank you, Bobby, personally for that right now. Thank you very much. The last thing I want to say to you while I have this moment is that those 3 things I just talked about have just scratched the surface. We have a very long way to go. But we're going in the right direction for the first time in over, let me see, LaSalle was out there discovering that so-called discovering it in 1679. So I assume he threw garbage overboard. So for the first time in a long time, we're going in the right direction. But ladies and gentlemen, we need your resources, which means your money. We need your time. But most importantly, we need your political courage. Because while we've got a great one here in Doug Martz, it's not enough to get the job done completely. So please join us and come along. It's going to be a great trip. Thanks very much.
Good evening. My name is Bill Neron. As Doug said, I'm City Councilman, Mayor Pro Tem of the City of St. Clair Shores. When Doug introduced me today to Bobby Kennedy, he said, "This is Bill Neron, he's a Republican." So that's such a bad thing? No. So anyway, when Doug first decided that he was going to do this, he gave me a call and he said, "Bill, would you mind joining?" And I said, "Mind? I'd be delighted to." He says, "Carl Merlinga and John Hertel are going to be on board." I said, "Yeah, so what's the problem here?" Well, they're both Democrats. So what? You know, this is not a Democrat problem. This is not a Republican problem. This is our problem. It got together. We did it together. We're going to clean it up together. So many times, things that have happened get bogged down in political mumbo-jumbo. Sometimes political egos get in the way and things don't get done. It winds up dying in the bureaucracy somewhere along the line. That's not going to happen this time. We're going to work together. We're going to do it what needs to be done. And thank you so very, very much for being here, and let's go together. Thank you.
One of the things that was mentioned by Bobby was that oftentimes you get finger pointing, people saying, don't look at me to clean up my pollution because I think somebody upstream or downstream contributes more than I do. I know when I filed the papers with our fight with the combined sewer overflow from Oakland County, that was their cry, that, well, there are hundreds of points of pollution. Why pick on us? Well, the chief reason is, first of all, you were the biggest, but secondly, you are government. And before we have the nerve to go down and tell a marina or to tell a business to clean up their backyard and to take care of the 5 gallons of discharge, it only makes sense that the people who are pouring in the millions and the billions should look to themselves first, but because before government should be asking for a sacrifice, government should clean up its own business. And as I said on the boat coming over, I'm in this as a citizen, and we need this organization because it's citizens that are going to keep the people in government honest. But I do have to have Mark Richardson from my office, the environmental prosecutor from our office, the first one in the state, the Assistant Prosecutor Mark Richardson, who carries on most of this work. But in closing, I would just like to say, hats off to Doug Martz, my personal hero. After all, when I do what I do, I'm simply filing papers in a court, an administrative agency, things that I've done 1,000 times, things for which I get paid for on a daily basis. But he had the courage and the nerve to get out there to put his reputation, to put his ego on the line, to ride out there with that Cadillac with that toilet on the top, to subject himself to public ridicule because he believed so deeply in what he was doing. His passion, his commitment, his willing to expose everything, to put everything on the line, moved me as a prosecutor for this county to do something. Moved John Hertel as the chairman of the board of this county to do something. Moved the whole board of commissioners to do something. But it proves what has been said many, many times, that the great movements of history don't come about because thousands of people get together. It starts with one person, and that was Doug Martz, joined by Brad Sands, and congratulations to them, the Riverkeepers.
Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. There's more, one more event